Welcome back. So with new CYL units means we get more fodder options, and there are 4 new types of skills on this banner, and I figured because there's like a lot of variety on here, it may be worth to talk about each individual skill in depth a bit, as well as who would make a really good user of said skill. And it's pretty simple for the most part. I assume most people who are pulling on the CYL banner are going to keep the units in question, but if you do want to fodder any of these units off for maybe a potential build on maybe one of your favorite units or whatever the case may be, I'm here to give you some guidance for that. So that's what we're here to do today. If you're planning on foddering any one of these 4 units off, then I'll give some guidance as to who will probably make the best users of it, as well as what you could really accomplish with the skill. So with that being said, we may as well just get right into it, starting with Brave Tiki. Brave Tiki comes with attack res finish, and you will have to take this skill in its entirety. You can't grab Menace if you really wanted it, because it is a tier 4 skill right off the bat, and we don't have any readily available attack res finish 3 options because it just came out, so duh. But if you do want the skill, you can't grab anything else. And it does apply for half of the skills on the banner. Some more than others, really depends. But nevertheless, attack res finish grants 7 attack res if you're within 3 spaces. And if you trigger a special during combat, then you get 5 extra true damage and healing for 7 HP. Which in my mind kind of screams you kind of want to use this for general tanking, or in some outlier cases, for player phase. And I'll go over the player phase option in a second, but generally, yeah, you want to use this for the enemy phase, just because 3 spaces and healing and yada yada yada. So let's talk about this real quick. So as you can see on screen, some of the more notable options will be the distant counter units who have distant counter built into their weapon. As you'll generally be omni-tanking with this skill, having the ability to counterattack regardless of the foe's range is going to be important, as you could always just be whittled down and be dealt with like that. So 2 notable options that come to mind are Winter Altina and Yanfei. Winter Altina is already a really good mixed tank as is, so with the additional healing and pairing it up with attack defense bulwark and twin blade, she'll not only be hitting really hard, but she'll also be healing 14 HP after each combat. 7 in combat and then 7 after combat, 14 total. It's pretty good. It is really expensive, I'll give you that, but this is probably one of her best sets when it comes to it. You don't want to really use Vantage because you are healing with this skill, so it's not really worth it. So after that point, you're basically just stacking up breath and joint drive attack, so you can consistently get damage out. And for that reason, I do think Winter Altina is definitely one of the best users of this skill. We also have Yanfei, and he would definitely much prefer the attack speed finish for, but we don't have that yet. But for what it's worth, he is really fast as is, so having the extra res isn't exactly the worst per se. So you could still run the same old build on him. With bulwark and finish, he'll heal 14 HP after each combat. Again, 7 in combat, 7 out of combat. And you stack up his speed with a forearm joint drive attack, so you're not potentially missing speed checks. Again, he will much prefer the attack speed finish for, so he can consistently get his damage reduction from his weapon. But regardless, you could also swap out attack defense bulwark for no follow-up, which is also a good alternative since he does lack it. And another notable option is Young Ike, or pretty much any unit with slaying distant counter. So it's really like the Ice. I might be missing a couple like Ossian and Sayri, but for the most part, slaying distant counter is a good combination because you could also run Vital Asher with Times Pulse. No follow-up in the B slot. You don't really need Bulwark for any of these, but Bulwark is definitely really solid with this skill because you're getting a lot of healing in general. And then with it, you're basically getting healing, no follow-up, and damage reduction from your entire kit, which is really solid. Which is why I would also recommend it on the Ikes, who could at least make use of it. And you know how I mentioned that there is some outlier for the player phase? Yeah, you could put this on Ascended Celica, and again, she would also much prefer attack speed finish, but because she does get healing from her A slot, if you were to pair it with Mystic Boost in the S slot, you would be healing 13 HP after each combat. Again, 7 in combat, 6 after combat. I have to specify just in case, but nevertheless, you'll be able to consistently loop Miracle from her weapon, thus making her player phase pretty much invincible unless you have enemy phase Brave, which most units don't. So she's going to be a really big menace, and I would also recommend just putting it on her. Outside of that, you have the Dragons who have the distant counter seal. So pretty much any mixed tank that would appreciate healing would really like this skill. So Medius and Halloween Rhea, for example. Medius is definitely one of the better options because he also works off the res outside of just general tanking because he needs it for his assured rebirth. And then you pair that up with distant counter, he's just going to be stupidly ridiculous to take down. But then you also have Halloween Rhea, who makes a really good option for this too, because not only does she get a guaranteed follow-up, but she also prevents guaranteed follow-ups. And even though any sort of no follow-up effect will pretty much shut that down, which is super common, Dragon Wall alongside attack risk finish will basically keep her healthy for a really good period of time. And as far as the attack risk finish candidates go, I would say these are probably some of the best ones, but you can definitely find alternative users to it that can at least meet some of the requirements. Next we have attack speed clash, which is a really solid player face skill in my opinion, mainly because you do get a lot of attack and speed from it. The only caveat with it is that either you or the enemy will have to move in order to get the bonus. So in my opinion, it's definitely best used on player phase units. But also, it's worth noting that if the unit in question moves at least 2 tiles, they also get attack speed penalty neutralization. So you can buff your attack and speed without any fear of getting panicked or it getting reversed by maybe a legion. So cases like that, it's also really good. As far as I'm aware, it also works with warp skills because it isn't movement that it's counting, it's tiles. So with something like Assault Troop or whatever the case may be, you're still moving tiles. Even though it's not actual movement and it won't come into play for something like Trace, you are still moving tiles. So it should work theoretically. The closest comparison to Clash would absolutely be Catch. And in my opinion, Catch does work really, really well as is, but you do have to keep in mind that it works off the foe's debuffs. So if they also have any sort of penalty neutralization, whether that's from Slick Fighter or maybe a Brunya or a Dune, then it's not going to go off. And if they don't even have 100% of their HP present, then the skill's not going to work in general. So that's something that Clash does have over Catch, which is really, really nice. But again, Clash does require either the unit or foe to move from their spot. So that can be a bit tricky if you don't have any means of either escaping, thus allowing the foe to catch up to you and attack, or you use it for the enemy phase in general. But for what it's worth, attack speed clash is a really, really good skill, but you just want to use it on units that can move, in my opinion, because it's way more consistent that way. So maybe units like Kent, who can run Coral Saber with Trace and an Arouse. If you have Arouse 4, then you already get no panic, so it's not really going to matter as much there. But nevertheless, if you only have Rouse 3, it's still good to have. And again, you still get 9 attack speed from it and penalty neutralization, so it's still a really coveted skill to have. You could also put it on somebody with maybe Assault Troop and then Close Call, so they can go in, Gale Force, get Close Call, and then run away with 3 spaces, so they effectively have a solid 4 space movement per combat and after combat, assuming they could get Gale Force off, which is really, really solid overall. And if you were to follow it up with maybe no follow-up support, such as Fallen Lilith, or Infantry No Follow, or even Infantry Speed Tactic, and we'll get into that in a second, this can work really, really well. And then you also have your flyers who could run Tempest, Gale Force, same thing with Trace, so they can enter 2 combats and then escape with Tempest movement and near Trace. So they could still move up to like 3 or 4 movement depending on whether or not they have to move after. And even if they don't have to move after, they more than likely will be able to take out the foe because they most likely did chip away at most of their health. So for what it's worth, Gale Force or any ability to run away after combat is definitely worth using Clash for. Next we get to Infantry Speed Tactic, which kind of just curb stomped Infantry No Follow, which came like a banner prior to it, which, oh well, now we have Infantry Speed Tactic, so that's cool. The only caveat comparatively to Infantry No Follow is that you do have to meet the tactic requirement, so you can't just run all infantry teams, as you won't be able to get the no follow-up effect going. However, this is not really that big of a deal comparatively if you use mixed teams anyway, so I would still say this is a direct upgrade. And even if you do have Infantry No Follow, you can still use this on other units because unlike Infantry No Follow, you could use this skill on any movement type, which is really, really, really good. As such, you can pretty much just shove this on any support unit and they'll pretty much do wonders for you. So one of the most notable candidates for this would be Bridal Catria, as she not only grants the Omni orders to everyone within 2 spaces, but now she can grant no follow-up, meaning that if you were to pair it up with maybe something like a Volk, for example, on Aether's defense, you could give them Wind Sweep, and then you could just double anyway, as you'll have the no follow-up effect, and you could basically have yourself a weird, like, mixed Ascended Joshua-esque sort of thing with the tempo effect, which does make him really, really, really potent. You also have Ashford, who will make a really solid user of this, because not only will you get the bonus doubler effect, but you also get extra movement and no follow-up, so you get 3 effects in 1, which is really, really solid. But then you could also put this on like 3 move dancers, such as Hatari Azura, who can not only provide no follow-up again with the skill, but she also gets the extra movement and the Spectrum 6, so you're buffing them really, really high. And in my opinion, these are like the 3 best options. You definitely have a lot more options available, but in terms of just overall practicality, these are probably some of the best ones. That being said though, these are super premium units, minus Astrid, but again, you still have to like randomly get her. The other 2 are seasonal, so if you do want to put it on someone more readily available, you can put it on Peony, who also grants the orders buff and visible buffs. And while she may not necessarily be the most amazing user of it, she's still a really solid user of it because again, you're still providing no follow-up to infantry units, which is still really good to have on supports in general. And you could put it on the newly released Gerald, as his Breaker Lance is support-oriented and combat-oriented. He may not be like the best combat unit per se, and he can still work with like flows, trace, yada yada yada, but he does have the unconditional panic effect that also inflicts -6 attack and defense on a targeted foe and units within 2 spaces of that foe, which is really good. So if you were to run something like even pulse tie, infantry speed tactic, you may want to stack up his HP instead of giving him attack and defense if you are looking to just make him a support unit. But also with a rally, he can still be a really solid support unit in general. In my opinion, these are really good units. Anybody that can just use support in general or who is a dedicated support unit will really like this skill. And then finally we have Speed Preempt, which is a speed check that gives the unit 100% advantage against any ranged unit, as long as they're faster of course, which shouldn't really be too big of an issue. However, this skill is definitely mostly like coveted on Brave Byleth because she does have her instant specials ready to go, which most units really can't do. And even if she does miss the kill, she has 75% damage reduction, meaning that she is probably the best user with this skill. But nevertheless, you can still use it on a good amount of units. Also, it's worth keeping note that you can only use this skill on ranged units. Any ranged unit, as long as they have 2 range. You can't put this on a sword, a lance, an axe, whatever the case may be. It has to be like a bow, a tome, staff, whatever. But nevertheless, there are units that can use this quite well, such as Aversa. Aversa is already a pretty big stat haul because she has the plug-in effect in her weapon, and she does get Spectrum 4 from her weapon as is. So as long as you can get the plug-in effect going, you can just run Speed Preempt and hopefully aim for one-shots. But even if she does miss the one-shot, she does have a lot of like deceptive bulk because not only are you debuffing their attack by a good amount, but she has a lot of HP anyway. And her res isn't exactly the worst at max investment, so she could actually make a pretty decent user of it. Beyond that, you also have Ashera, who's just a really solid nuke in general because she hits extremely hard thanks to Order Sentience. And because she has null panic, you don't have to worry about like panic effects, so her damage output will be generally consistent, which is why I do think she's one of the better users for it, mainly because not only can you initiate without any worry of just taking them out, but you can also do it in the enemy phase, and she won't easily go down as long as A, she can one-shot, and B, the foe doesn't target her defense. Because if they target her defense and she does miss the kill, then she can fall in combat, but she does hit extremely hard as is, so I wouldn't really worry about putting it on her if you are kind of hesitant. Beyond that, you have Spring Veronica, who does mimic Ashera in a lot of cases because she does have that like super Blade Tome effect. And because she's a flyer, she does also have access to Speed Res Hold and other similar effects, making Speed Preempt, making the conditional of Speed Preempt and her ability to one-shot a lot easier to manage. But I don't know necessarily which one's going to hit harder. I think Spring Veronica is going to hit harder in general, but because she is green, she can still flounder 2 red units, so you do have to keep that in mind. But nevertheless, she isn't exactly the worst user of it because again, her damage output is really high as is. Beyond that, you have Broadleaf users who can also use this really well because it's 100% advantage, and even if they miss the kill, they can still potentially fall back on their bulk, similar to the likes of Chronia. So it does work in that regard. You do have to keep in mind though that because it only works against ranged units, you will want to pair them with the likes of Near Save. And that's not exactly the worst thing to ask because 100% advantage against ranged foes means that any ranged foe that initiates combat on them, as long as they meet the condition, will more than likely struggle to take them out, which is pretty good. But again, anything with penalty neutralization will also prove an issue because Broadleaf does require debuffs on the foe to work. But I think Matthew in particular could actually work pretty decently with it, mainly because he also has access to the likes of Speed Smoke 4 and decent speed for what it is thanks to his Resplendent. His attack still could use work, but again, you could also put this on like any unit with like notable speed and decent bulk and good attack, and it'll probably still do a lot better. But I figured I'd mention Matthew because he's one of the more easily accessible options. And then outside of that, you can do this gimmicky instant lethality set with Quick Dagger, Times Pulse, and Quick Impulse. So no matter what, you're always getting lethality off on the first shot. The only caveat is that after that lethality goes off, you're basically just prone to whatever because you won't have the instant special ready to go, but it can still be one of those gotcha moments on enemies, as you will get the instant lethality, and that's pretty much it. If we do end up getting a spiral effect that can be applied to allies as a support, then I can see this working a lot better in the future, but as is, it may not be worth using unless you just kind of want that like instant lethality, like gotcha, like security sort of thing. But nevertheless, I thought I'd bring this up anyway, because I do think there is somewhat of a potential here with it. And those are pretty much all the notable skills. I didn't bother bringing up the other skills that these units come with, mainly because of two reasons. A, 2 of the units can only be inherited with that new skill. So with Seliph and Tiki, you can only get attack res finish and attack speed clash. And B, they already existed, so I feel like players already have a good idea of what these skills entail and who they want them on anyway. So even though you can get infantry speed tactic and maybe trace and surge sparrow, depending on which one you want, from Chrom, or if you have the fodder readily available, speed res hold or catch with speed preempt, I feel like they're basic enough as is that you already know what they entail and who you'd want them on anyway. As such, I didn't really bring them up. But you'll have to let me know who you foddered these units to, if you did whatsoever, because I am curious on who you put these units on. Anyway, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.